Hey guys, hi, welcome back once again. My name is Vaishali, and today I'd like to talk about changing expectations and even communicating our expectations. So, first, let's talk about expectations. It actually comes from the Latin word which means an awaiting, even a desire or a hope. Think of a pregnant woman awaiting or expecting her first child, or a second one, or a third one. Think of a student awaiting for the results after giving an examination. Think of the feel-good factor after having worked out or after having done anything that we enjoy doing. Or for me personally, driving on a road that is absolutely traffic-free. I think that would be brilliant. Too high an expectation? Probably yes. Will I be let down? To some extent, yes. Can I handle it? On some days much better when compared to other days. So is it then inhuman to have expectations? For there are tons of sayings that point out that the root of all suffering is desires and expectations. And they're true to some degree, to some extent, and yet desire is the birthplace of all creativity as well. The hope for something makes us want to work towards an outcome that we desire, that we aspire for, and that's an expectation. For why would anybody want to do anything if there was no expectation, if there was no desire to create anything? So can it then all be so black and white? Can we then truly say that desire and expectations are the root cause of all suffering? Maybe to some extent they are, and maybe to some extent they are the root cause of all greatest creativity as well. Right from our childhood, we are taught, we are conditioned, we are programmed to look at things in absolute black and white, in yes or no, true and false. Unfortunately or unfortunately, most things about life are in the gray zone, which is what we are trying to always perceive and comprehend and process through our gray matter. And maybe that's where most of our friction and our conflicts, both internal and external, come in, surface up. For we are taught and trained and socialized to think in terms of absolutes and not in terms of relativity, in terms of two extremes, conveniently forgetting that there's a huge space in between those two extremes. And that's where all the shades of black and white and gray, relatively and metaphorically, coexist. So coming back to the topic of changing expectations and even communicating expectations, I recently had an interesting conversation with a 90-year-old. Let's just say that this person was almost born a century back. Times were different, and so were the desires, the aspirations, and the expectations. As we talked, and the more I listened and even later journaled and reflected, I realized that men and women both had specific roles in their lives. They didn't necessarily have a lot of choices. Their identities were quite restricted and confined. There was a lot of stability and structure that to some degree was also probably rigidly codified. I realized that love was not a thing that people generally talked of. For she even said, "Hamare time pe baat karte," to somebody would have said, "Wo kis chiriya ka naam hai?" So love was not a thing that people generally talked of and therefore probably never even aspired for in a marriage. For coupling or marriage was an alliance, an arrangement chosen and made by the family and for the family and community. And too many times the people who were going to be in a marital alliance, in a partnership for life, had not even seen each other till after they got married. And maybe to some extent it could have been helpful, for it removed our personal preconceived biases, but then it also made little space for our personal preferences and choices. And funnily enough, these two strangers who had never even seen each other could create a family together. Reflecting on that did make me cringe a bit, despite having the information and the knowledge of that. I learned that marriage or any other relationship, human connection apart from friendship, was about prescribed duties and following norms. So parents passed down commandments or orders which children most adhered to without questioning. Parents and their children probably heard each other, but quite likely did not listen to each other to understand each other, which in hindsight tells me that to some extent both parties felt ununderstood, and thereby they quite likely felt unheard and unseen as well, which at this point in time reminds me of the saying, children should be seen and not be heard, which again would have been normalized, for that was the prevalent accepted way of functioning and existing. I asked her if she felt love for her husband or if he loved her even. Her answer was quite simple, quite pragmatic. In our times, duty and love was the same thing. And in my head I went, if duty and love were the same thing, I asked her, did she enjoy her duties? Enjoy her duties as a mother, as a homemaker, as a wife, as a daughter-in-law, essentially in all her roles. And she said again, love and duty were the same thing. Responsibility and love was the same thing. And then she paused before continuing. However, if you're asking me of the love that probably resonates as Radha Krishna love, as my grandchild talks of love today, I probably had not experienced that. But there was no expectation of that too at that point in time, which then made me think, if there was no vocabulary to understand that, to express that, then in all likelihood, there was also no desire to create and experience that as well in the first place. I then asked her if her husband loved his work, was passionate about his work, did he enjoy doing it? To which she told me that he is no more. But then, as she continued, her answer shocked me again. Revealing something more nuanced, she said, he was a servant of the government, a government servant. Which servant truly enjoys their work, is passionate about their work? At least I've not come across a servant who likes to be subservient to somebody else. And maybe over here she was talking about the role play again, rather than the person offering their services to somebody. She went on to state, yes, it did have its perks. It was a job, a duty which he dutifully did, and it took care of us when he was alive and even after that. She also added, he worked overtime to support us, which meant that he was less available as a husband and as a father. And in some ways it implied to me that he must have also felt equally unheard and unseen, and probably disconnected with his children and his life partner too. And when I brought that up to her gently, she said, but that was what we all did. And then with so many kids and so many family members at that point in time, who had the time for real connection? I wondered if she ever saw around her that husband and wife could be friends, which I did ask her about, and not surprisingly she said, well, with the age gap of 10 to 15 years, you really could not expect us to be friends. And also we never had people around us demonstrating that kind of a relationship between husband and wife. And maybe, but then we were required to do our duties well, fulfill our obligations well, and if we did that, we probably would have a chance at going to heaven. And as she said that, it brought another realization to me. Today we want to create heaven on earth. And here was this lady who thought of going to heaven after fulfilling all of her earthly duties. She had bare minimal expectation even with regards to her own identity. There was, generally speaking, in all likelihood, no concept of self-reflection, of self-development, for a person was identified by the roles they played, and more so if they played it well. However, today, many a times, at least in some parts of the world, we do get to choose our role plays. At one point in time, when obligatory duties and responsibilities were the norm and were expected by the others and even from one's own self, and doing those well demonstrated love, today we get to create marital alliances marinated in love and friendship, which involves negotiable duties and responsibilities as well. Now this person has 8 kids, quite incomprehensible to many of us at this point in time today, which in a way also tells me that at one point in time, sex was a marital duty, which still is today in many parts of the country and the world at large. However, in some parts of the country and the world, it, along with gender, has also become a choice. It's not a marital duty anymore. It's a matter of consent to some relative extent, which is where we also have the inclusion of the concept of marital rape as well. At one point in time, when heaven was somewhere out there in the sky, we now wish and even want to have a chance and a choice to create heaven on earth, experience heaven within and in between us. At one point in time, when happiness happened out of hapstance, a chance occurrence, today we desire and even want to be the choice makers and the creators and co-creators of our happiness. We want to work towards our happiness, which to me somewhere sounds like the contradictory, probably even evolved change of desires and expectations. So then my question is, are we aiming too high? And to me personally, it sounds like saying we wish to be empowered, which naturally evolves out of educated choices. But can we get them without accountability, both personal and interpersonal? We like the idea of heaven on earth, but then it's too huge a task to be undertaken by me, or somebody else that I'm engaging with. And maybe it calls for too much of work. So then, can work of such mammoth proportions with such huge expectations coexist with happiness if we wish to be the creators and co-creators of that? And I'd ask this question even to that lady. So are our expectations too high today? And she said, maybe to some degree, yes, they are too high. And at times you're setting yourself up for big disappointments. But then if you don't opt for it, you don't open yourself up to creating your own heaven as well, which requires very hard work and probably harder choices as well. I even asked her about her biggest disappointments, and she said, having a relationship with her own mother and daughters, like her daughters and one of her son has with their own kids, to the point where she even feels envious of them at times. I asked her about her passions, what brings her alive, and very gently smiling, she said, she's still clueless about it. She had never had the time beyond her role play to even understand what her own passion were, if she had any or none at all. And then, as if talking to herself, she said, I wish I knew this in the past, that life exists beyond roles and that most people are stuck in their roles like herself because their entire life story, their identity was in keeping with the roles and how well they played it, in keeping with what had been told to them. Gently adding that all of those role plays were being co-created by somebody else as well. And suddenly when those people who are engaged in equal role play depart, leave, there's suddenly an emptiness which cannot be described and defined. I don't know what my passion is, and I don't know who I am today without any of those role plays. And I'm too old to find that out now. Hearing that not only saddened me, but it also disheartened me, whilst giving me some profound, deep insights as well. And from that conversation, as I reflected back, what I understood was that at one point in time, and even till date, across many cultures, regions, and our history, many of us have been outsourcing our choices, desires, happiness, and expectations. So when today we have more choices and resources, and probably even more aspirations, desires, and thereby higher expectations towards creating our own lives, I wonder if it can be categorically called as bad or negative. I also wonder if it can be called as good and delightful. Or maybe there's a grey space in between which we have still not learned to tread. Maybe we still need to learn to better communicate and negotiate our desires, aspirations, and expectations, which are of course co-shared and co-created, and even communicating our non-negotiables. Because without communicating our non-negotiables, it's difficult to communicate our negotiables in the first place. And we really cannot communicate them without self-awareness of some kind. And then even realizing that those negotiables and non-negotiables are not a one-time thing, but a process that's constantly being studied, analyzed, and renegotiated with collaborative presence and efforts. Because if happiness is a choice and heaven needs to be created here, then we even need the choice to put in some kind of a work there. Let's try and reflect on that. Let's try and reflect what our desires and our expectations are. Let's try and see what work we'll need to put in to meet those expectations and desires, one step at a time. And let's try and reflect on even those aspects that we find scary about communicating our desires, our expectations, to create our own happiness, to create our own heaven on earth. Let's try and think about that for ourselves, and I will see you once again the next week. Till then, stay tuned in. And guys, if you do like the contextual content of my videos, please do like, share, and subscribe.